Hi, third graders. We are back with Pax. I'm going to be reading chapters 15 and 16. The sun burned through a dawn fog. The two foxes had been traveling for hours, but Gray was slow and rested often, so they had only just reached the valley basin. For the most part, Pax respectfully flanked the older fox, but sometimes he broke away to race at full speed for long, glorious minutes before circling back. He had never run before, not really. He'd sprinted around the borders of his pens or across the yard, but this running was a different thing. Neat oval paws heeled down, skimming the ground only for traction as he galloped faster and faster over great sweeps of grass. Yesterday's meal had cleared his senses and fueled his muscles, but now the eggs were gone from his belly, and the smells of the warming valley brought on a powerful hunger. Where the humans were, there would be food. How far? 2 days' travel. Gray described a place of old stone walls where the earth smelled faintly of tar and hemp, bordered by a river. We will reach it by dusk. The human settlements are another day's travel beyond that. Pax did not remember human settlements. He did not remember a river. Of his home, he remembered the looming door. He remembered oaks ringing the house, the overgrown remains of a flower garden he was never allowed into, and the sounds of a road. He sensed that other humans lived along this road, but had never encountered them. These memories were fading, as was the memory of being caged. He could no longer recall what the sky looked like through hexagons of cage wire. He remembered his boy, though, the hazel eyes with their odd round pupils, the way Peter would close them and throw his head back and yelp something near a bark when he was delighted. His salty neck that smelled sometimes of sweat and sometimes of soap. His hands always moving, with their scent of chocolate, which Pax loved, and a mitt leather, which he loathed. As the two foxes traveled on, Pax reflected on the puzzle of the other scent of his boy, his underlying scent. It hung between grief and yearning, and it welled from a deep ache for something that Pax could never divine. Sometimes in the boy's nest room, his grief-yearning scent was so strong that it overpowered everything else, and yet his boy made no move to acquire whatever it was he wanted so badly. Whenever Pax caught that scent, he could hurry from wherever he was to find Peter flung across his bed, clutching the objects he kept hidden in the bottom drawer of his bureau, his face set in hard ridges. Pax would nose Peter's shirt sleeve or claw up the curtains, then pretend to lose his footing and fall to the floor, anything to get his boy to play. But when the grief-yearning scent was strongest, none of his tricks would work. On those days, Peter would shoo Pax outside and shut the door. Remembering this, Pax felt the urge to run again, but not for the joy of it, this war that is coming. Are you sure it will harm all in its path, even the youth? Everything. It will destroy everything. Pax nosed Gray, respectful but urgent. They must hurry. The older fox studied the younger one for a moment, then began to trot. They crossed the marshy seam of the valley and climbed the rocky cliffs shoulder to shoulder this time. At the top of the rise, the two foxes stopped. Gray was panting hard. Ahead, the pines towered up, promising long, cool pools of shade. But the markings here were strong. The challenger hunted this territory, and the threat in his scent was unmistakable. And almost immediately, the ground beat with the light staccato of paws tearing towards them. Pax and Gray had barely braced themselves when the tawny fox burst from the underbrush, lips curled in a snarl, tail lashing. Pax shrank back, but Gray advanced calmly, his body lowered enough to declare non-aggression. We are only passing through. The challenger ignored the peaceful greeting and sprang, hitting the old fox in the flank and pinning him down, then sank his teeth into Gray's thin neck. At Gray's pain scream, Pax's guard hairs lifted and his heartbeat quickened. His muscles thrummed with a fury he'd known only once, in the early days with his humans. The father had raised a hand to the boy, and Pax had shot across the room without thought, small kit teeth tearing fiercely through the man's pant leg. Now, as it had then, his back arched and a low growl rumbled deep in his throat. The challenger spun around in surprise, and Pax charged him headlong. They rolled, teeth clipping at tender ears, hind claws digging for purchase in soft belly fur. The yellow fox was more skilled, but Pax's fighting was fueled by an instinct to protect. When his teeth found the other's throat, the challenger scrambled to his feet and backed off, whimpering. Pax leaped in front of Gray, shielding him as he'd shielded the boy that long time ago. Lifted his chest and growled a warning. The challenger slunk away. Pax shook off the blood from a dozen superficial scratches and then cleaned Gray's wound. The puncture was deep. He urged Gray to go back. No, I will travel. The two padded steadily for an hour through light woods, Pax restraining himself to keep pace with the ailing Gray, relieved at least that they kept moving. But when a murder of crows landed on the bare arms of a pecan tree, Gray doubled back and sat down at its base, ears pricked up intently at the commotion. Pax waited, not patiently. After a moment, the old fox barked for him. The war is moving closer. How do you know this? The crows. Listen. Pax cocked his head. More shrieking birds swept in, descending into the lower branches, then flapping up again to higher perches in a cyclone of distress. They're upset. The crows hulked their shoulders, spiked their feathers, jerked and dipped their shrieking beaks. Their discord set Pax's nerves on edge. There is disorder. He attended more carefully. What he sensed alarmed him. He tried to describe it. Air choked with death, fire and smoke, blood in a river, the river running red with it, the earth drowning in blood. Chaos. Everything is broken. The fibers of the trees, the clouds, even the air is broken. Yes, war. Where? Pax attuned himself once more. West, still distant but nearing. And now a small group of war sick has come from the south to meet it. From the south. Pax paced while Gray struggled to his feet. He offered again to travel alone, and again Gray refused to turn back home. Again they set out, and again their pace was slower than Pax wanted. They stopped only for meals and grubs and berries, and whenever they did, Pax searched the air for any trace of his boy's scent, for the faintest sound of his voice. None. None. He lifted his muzzle and bayed a single aching note. It had been so long since he'd seen his boy. Before this, they'd never been apart for more than half a day. Often, Peter would leave in the morning and Pax would pace his pen in increasing distress until the afternoon when Peter would come home, smelling of young humans and of strange breath of the large yellow bus that delivered him. With the afternoon, Pax could reassure himself his boy was all right, examining him for any sign of injury before he could relax into play. It was afternoon now. He bayed again, and this time Gray lifted his voice in an echo of loss. But when Pax trotted back to the path to resume the journey, Gray faltered. Pax could see that he needed rest. He led the wounded fox to a mossy circle of shade beneath a pine. Gray laid his cheek on his paws, and before Pax had even finished cleaning his wound again, he was asleep. As Pax kept watch, he thought of doing favorite things with his boy when he found him, tumbling together outside, playing hunting games, exploring the grassed yard and the bit of woods behind it. He remembered the ways his boy would reward him, the full smiles of greeting, the thorough neck scratchings, Peter's fingers digging in just hard enough. He recalled the peace of laying at his boy's feet in front of the fire. These thoughts calmed Pax, and he dozed with the memory of Peter's knuckles kneading the loose skin between his shoulder blades, so real that his fur ruffled under it, until a shifting breeze brought the scent that called him to instant alert. Meat. Roasted meat, the kind his humans sometimes cooked over a fire in the yard. His boy would feed him bits of this meat, dripping with fat. For days afterwards, Pax would scour the ashy fire bed for overlooked scraps. Even the charred bones were treasures. Pax got to his paws to sniff more deeply. Yes, roasted meat. He knows the sleeping Gray. Humans are near. Gray moved more easily after his rest, and the two foxes kept up a loping pace. As they got closer, though, Pax charged ahead. His body was light, the fat burned off from days of scarce food. He ran as foxes are meant to run, compact body arrowing through the air at a swiftness that rippled his fur. The new joy of speed, the urgency of coming night, the hope of reunion with his boy, these things transformed him into something that shot like liquid fire between the trees, something gravity couldn't touch. Pax could have run forever. Until he galloped out from the woods and saw ahead of him a wide river. Beyond that stretched a clear field, flat and then rising to massive crumbling stone walls. It was dusk now, and at the far corner of the stone ruins a dozen men were gathered around a fire eating. Beyond them were a cluster of tents and several large vehicles. The wind had shifted to the east. The grilled meat smoke still hung heavy in the air, but Pax could only get a general scent of the humans. He bounded up and down the river's edge, frustrated, but from no direction could he differentiate one human scent from another. At least Pax knew his boy was not here. None of the humans had his reedy form. None moved with the same quick energy. None held himself as Peter had, upright but with a downward cant of his head. He was relieved. The other scents of the encampment, smoke, diesel, scorched metal, and a strange, dark electrical odor, were things he would have herded Peter away from. Gray limped from the woods and flopped to the riverbank beside Pax. Together, the two foxes watched the men. They had finished eating, but they remained around the fire, talking and laughing. They are war-sick? Pax wanted to know. Not now. They are peaceful now. I remember this peace. The old fox curled his forelegs under his chest. At the end of the day, the humans lived with gathered like those across the river. Suddenly, Pax remembered. He hadn't seen something similar as well. It hadn't happened for several years, but sometimes at the end of the day, his humans would sit together on his boy's nest. The father would lay a hard box, flat and thin and made of many layers of paper across his lap. Paper like Pax's own bedding, but not shredded, and with many marks. His humans would peel these layers one by one and study them. Pax remembered that his humans were most linked together on those evenings, and with their harmony he could let down his guard. Pax felt a strange sensation, as if his chest were no longer large enough for his heart. The foxes turned back to the men. Some were still crouched around the fire, while others moved with lanterns between the equipment and the tents. With full darkness, the remaining men rose from the fireside. They dumped out mugs of coffee, scuffed dirt over flames, and ducked into tents. Gray rose also and limped uphill to the protection of a sweeping hemlock bough. He circled and curled himself up on the pine-needled ground underneath, his nose tucked under his brush. The smell of the meat had made Pax too hungry to rest. He trotted to the edge of the river. Its current was soft. He dipped his head and drank, and then jumped to a rock, slippery with moss, but stable. Then, gaze fixed on the glow of the dying embers, he chose. A leap, a splash, and again his body did what it had never done before, but was meant to do all along. He swam. A moment later, he climbed to the bank and shook himself off. Neither movement nor sound came from the tents. Pax crept silently across the field and climbed the rise. He circled the bounds of the camp, edging closer and closer to the firebed. The sense of danger was strong. It was hard not to flee. He was, after all, accustomed only to his two humans, the one he loved, the one he tolerated. Several times he crept to the very rim of the firebed, found the smell of meat laced with the warning scent of war-sick men, then leaped back. A discarded pork bone, still redolent with fat, proved too much to resist. That Pax darted in. As he gulped the meat, ash gritted but still warm, the rustle of canvas startled him. He froze. A man emerged from a tent, silhouetted by lantern light. He stretched, and a long shadow snaked out to cloak the watching fox. The man turned away and relieved himself on a bush. The scent of his urine traveled to Pax, and he bristled at the sharp alert. His boy's father. Okay, chapter 16. That's enough. The words, along with Vola's hand on Peter's shoulder, were a welcome relief. His foot throbbed, his shoulders ached, and his armpits were so chafed that they were bleeding. 2 days of boot camp Vola, the secret name he'd christened the torture sensations in which he crutched uphill, dragged himself over stony ground on his elbows, and pitched mountains of hay balanced on one foot, had worn him out. He swung around to face the cabin, suddenly not even sure he could make it that far. But above the roof of the cabin, the hills were veiled with rain clouds. Ooh, sorry, there's a bug by me. Night was coming. He thought of Pax, wet and cold. I could keep going. No, you'll undo the good if you push too fast. Peter nodded and took a step towards the cabin, but Vola shook her head. Not yet. She pointed to the barn, the third condition. The barn seemed impossibly far away. Peter looked back at the cabin. He wanted to fall into that hammock. He planted his crutch tips in a deliberate show. What is it? Nothing much. You're going to work some puppets for me. Marionettes. That sound too hard? Marionettes? I don't get it. You know what they are? Sure. He pictured the ones he'd seen up close, Punch and Judy characters with long chins and sharp noses at a street fair when he'd been a little kid. Dead-eyed and skeletony as starving rats, the puppeteer had jerked them across the stage in twitchy rushes that had left him with nightmares for weeks. What about them? Vola eyed him for a moment before answering. Another true piece of myself I recovered. I remembered that I'd made some marionettes for my little nieces when I was a teenager. I remember how much I loved carving the wood. She pulled 2 scarves from her overalls and handed them over with a sigh. Wrap those hand grips. You're still hanging off the crutches. Take the weight on your palms, child. Spread it to your arms even when you're just standing there. Vola's unexpected kindness undid Peter. One minute she'd be barking at him for a dozen pull-ups or shooting his fingers at his face, warning him not to get too close. It was comfortable that way, like home. But the next minute she'd rub her salve into his aching shoulders or sand the splinters off his crutches, or drop her chores to fix him a mug of hot chocolate. And he'd realized how much care she was putting into making him strong and mobile, and he felt guilty. He felt guilty now, winding the soft cloth around the hand grips, so he told her what he figured she wanted to hear. Your nieces must have been really happy to get such great presents. But he doubted it. Those nieces of hers had probably stuffed those rat, skeleton-y, dead-eyed puppets right into the trash the first night they'd gotten them. No bad dreams. Vola shrugged, but Peter could tell she was secretly pleased by his words, and his guilt eased. He arranged his weight on his sore palms and followed her to the barn. In the doorway, he paused to draw in the cool air. It smelled of wood and hay and linseed oil and varnish. All good scents, Peter thought, separating them out, and really good together. He swung inside. Vola crossed to the opposite wall and one draped in burlap. Peter hung back. That wall had unnerved him the first day. She pulled the material aside and he nearly lost his balance, as though what he saw had hit him with a physical force. The puppets, marionettes. He could see now that they were marionettes hanging off the wall, were spookily realistic, and yet nothing like he'd ever seen. He stepped closer and found his voice. Their eyes. My grandmother's jewelry. She had long jet necklaces. The pupils are filled with those beads. They flash in the light, make my friends seem alive. Peter fell silent again, and Vola didn't disturb him as he studied the creatures hanging in front of him. 5 were human, a king and a queen, a child, and a pirate or sailor, and a sorceress. The rest, animals. All the heads were wooden, nearly human-sized, and huge-eyed, but the bodies were of a wild variety of materials. A tortoise was shelled with a green and orange gourd. Pine cone bracts formed a serpent scale, and feathers. Almost all the puppets wore an assortment of feathers as hair or headdresses, or cloaks or breeches. Looped neatly over pegs beside each marionette was an array of dowels and paddles strung together with thin black cord. In the center of the wall hung what Peter guessed was the largest puppet, covered by a separate piece of cloth. Vola removed it, and he gasped. The great bird's wings were magnificent, probably a good 5 feet at full span. Hundreds of dark feathers gracefully overlapped each other in perfect rows, and tips painted red as it licked the fire. Vola lifted it from its perch and carried it over to Peter. Most of the others are head and shoulder puppets, but this one needs to fly. I jointed him at the elbow. When he soars, you can almost feel the wind. Go ahead, you can touch him. Peter reached out. His fingertips stroked his sleek, feathered shoulder. Then the sharp wooden beak painted a bright gold. The bird's eyes glittered huge and black. He dropped his hand. So what do I have to do with this? Lola motioned to the hay bales. May as well sit down. I'm going to begin at the beginning. Peter sank onto a bale of hay, grateful for the rest. He watched as Vola hung the great bird back up. She pulled a small book from a niche in the wall, then came and sat beside Peter with it cradled in her hands. I killed someone. She looked up. Peter wasn't quick enough to cover his shock. She heaved a sigh, thick with disgust. No matter what Dableman lines they feed you about learning trades and reaching your potential, you're there to kill people. Kill or be killed. That's the contract in war. That wasn't true. His father, for example. You won't be fighting, right? Peter had pressed. His father had laughed and said no, he'd just be doing pretty much what he did as a civilian, laying wires. Peter didn't bother correcting Vola, though, because the look on her face was so wrecked. You killed someone. I probably killed a lot of people, or at least contributed to their death. But this one I saw. After. I had to search his body. We were trained to look for weapons, anything we could use. I dropped to my knees. I had to touch him, looking for those weapons. I remember being shocked at the feel of him. I was a medic, but still I half expected him to be plastic, not real, the way they taught us to think of the enemy in our training. But of course he was. He was warm. It was cold out, and he was giving off warmth, as if his life was steaming out of him. And I was touching him without his permission. I'd murder him, but what bothered me was that he had lost the right to say yes or no about what happened to him. You probably think that's crazy, don't you? Peter's mouth had gone dry. He didn't know what to say, and then suddenly he thought of the kind-eyed therapist he did know. That must have been hard for you. Vola looked at him with a surprised relief on her face. She nodded. Suddenly I was desperate to know who he was, where he'd come from, what he cared about, who he loved. His mouth was open as if he might have wanted to speak to me. I realized something then, that even though he was a man, even though he was a different race, even though he had grown up in a different country, we might have had a lot in common. Important things, more important than which army had drafted us. Two, but not two. But I'd killed him, so now we would never know. I searched his body not for weapons, but for clues to who he had been. Bola went silent, her face so devastated that Peter wanted to look away. And this. Bola lifted the book, The 7 Voyages of Sinbad, part of the Arabian Nights series, in his pocket. He'd carried it into war, so it had to have meant something. An old copy, so probably it had been his favorite as a boy. Sinbad was brave, so maybe he thought it brought him courage, or maybe he just wanted to remember that once he had been a little boy, and he had read books and felt safe. A page was bookmarked, the story of how Sinbad escapes from the roc's nest. I figured that story helped him believe that one day he'd escape too and get back home. Vola got up. She lifted the great winged puppet off the wall again. The rock. This bird could snatch up elephants in its talons. Look at it. She carried the bird back to Peter and turned its beak to face him. Its gaze was so fierce that Peter shrank back. What do I have to do with this? He asked again. That book was so important to that soldier that he'd carried it to war. I figured since I'd taken his life, I owed him something. I owed it to him to tell the story that meant so much to him. I carved all these puppets, and I've been telling the story of Sinbad escaping from the rock here in my barn for nearly 20 years. Bola handed the control apparatus to Peter, and now finally I'm going to get to see what it looks like. All right. Thank you guys for listening. I'll be back tomorrow with chapters, I think, 17 and 18. Have a good day, guys.